The website affiliated with Relevant Magazine recently published an article titled A Third Way on Gun Reform. And this is an excellent example, one of two that we are going to use today to describe, outline, and illustrate the psychologist's fallacy, or the sometimes also known as the view from above fallacy. And so if you want to support the show, you can remember to head over to redactedllc.com. That's where you're going to find our merch. Or if you want to support us further, you can do not the Patreon version, but the, what do you call it? Redactedculture.locals.com, because we're using locals instead of Patreon for the behind the scenes black site content. But on to the discussion, onto this, onto what needs to be done today. So in this article written by Ellen Hayes, which was published on June 27th, 2023, which in America's history is probably going to be related to some political event. It begins with an argument, an appeal to there being a third way, maybe a third option in regards to the highly polarized subject when it comes to guns and gun control and gun rights and the rights of the individuals in our country to keep and bear arms. And she starts her article, which tells the story, kind of relates to some of what happened in Nashville, and she reveals that, or she goes on to claim that there is a decent number of people. There's a nearly half, there's a growing number or a decent number of people or a respectable number of people within the specifically like the church, even the Southern Baptist Convention, that believes that something needs to be done. Right? There's this there's this response to the shooting, or to the numbers of shootings that have happened in the last year or so, that specifically point to a need for action, and that this sentiment can be seen within the church, or at least certain forms of church leadership. And she goes on to say that this author, Brené Brown, captures the plight of, and I'm quoting now, author Brené Brown captures the plight of those who find themselves in the middle ground, stating, "I exist in that lonely space between all guns and no guns, a space that feels," in their brackets, "defined by criticism and judgment." And so the article here goes on to talk about basically that, suggesting, desiring that there's a desire for a new way to have a conversation over whether you want to call it gun control, gun reform, or the human right to bear arms. And what we end up at the end of the article, though, is that there's various conversations sort of describing the difficulties people have in these kind of conversations, and how not many conversations are heard between peoples that are willing to talk about differing opinions on certain things, which what might be described as some sort of middle ground. What she ends up concluding with is something that sounds a lot like this. I'll just go straight to quoting it. Though the issue of gun control reform may appear overwhelming, there is reason for hope. Progress has already been achieved in some areas, with states implementing red flag laws, exceeding or extending background check periods, and enacting assault weapons bans. Grassroots initiatives and community-led efforts, such as a gun buyback program, also have the potential to make a substantial impact. And so what the author does here, and why it's referred to as a view from above fallacy, is that she proposes that there is a third way, or she is placing herself in the position as an author, or as in the way that she writes the article, implying that she is coming at this from an objective position. Now, she doesn't actually go forward and say that, which is a good thing, because if that were to be the case, then it would be a flat out red flag. However, what the article suggests, and in the tone of the article and the presentation of the article, is that she said that the idea that there's a dichotomy between you can either have the right to bear arms, or you have absolute control, is a false dichotomy. And that can be considered somewhat reasonable, because what you're looking at is contending worldviews, and no one has an absolute mastery over the world in that sense. And so there is like that issue. But what she does, though, that is a little bit subversive, in fact quite subversive, is that she spends her time writing the article about how there is a third option for the stalemate on gun control and gun rights and rights to bear arms in this state, in this country. And then she reveals that she's not actually approaching it from a third way. A third way is actually just the way that is her way, which is the gun control side. So in other words, you could say, and let's kind of break this down even a little bit more plainly. She said there's one view there's one view about gun control, or there's one view that people have the right to bear arms, and there's another view that the state should be implementing controls in order to safeguard the lives of children, or whatever the argument is of the day. And then there's a third way, there's a third option, which is funny because those are contradictory, or those are conflicting worldviews. Let's bring this back up here. There are conflicting worldviews, and then she's suggesting that she has a third way to bring to the table, which actually just ends up being one of those two ways. And the reason why this is a fallacy is because the implication of a view from above, that she's able to look at both positions or look at what's going on, would be the fallacy, as if she's not a part of the thing being observed. So that's one thing, that's one way of describing the view from above fallacy specifically. This is why we get the word view from above, is it implies that the individual who is giving their perspective or their argument is not also within the context of the argument themselves, or that they are not affected by the conditions of the argument and the state of a tension between two groups. Because what she does is she says there's a third way. She's saying, oh, well, look, there's these people that have these ideas, and then these people that have these ideas, or she's implying that within a gun reform, gun control conversation. And there's a third way, and that third way is in the, might be something like the middle. People refer to it as the compromise. And that third way is actually just this group's entire intention from the beginning. And so that's what that fallacy looks like. That's what it's a common, it's morally, I guess it more often appears in rhetoric than it does in logic. That more often appears in a rhetorical argument format than it does in a way where somebody is trying to argue something like modus tollens and implications within the relationship between premises and an argument, and so on and so forth, because it wouldn't really work in the frame of logic. Especially prepositional logic. So that being the case, what is another example, though, contextually speaking, that we can use regarding the view from above fallacy? We're going to use a book here real quick. This is Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, or Dave Grossman's book on killing, which is a very, very useful read. That was a really bad shot on the camera. Let's see if we can get that one. Yeah. This is Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman's book called On Killing, which is a useful book, and it's a very for those who are involved in both gun culture, military, philosophy, and psychology, in revolving around the subjects of violence. It's one of those books that is at least worth reading. It's sort of like you should have it under your belt and on your shelf, because it is a piece of literature that, despite some of the challenges with the arguments that he makes within the book, has sort of paved a way at a time for further discussions and conversations and concepts within how we think about violence and people's capacity and capability, as well as how we think about it in a moral framework. So, but this is one of the examples, and it is, let's see, and it is in this book specifically where we see one of the early and well thought out or well written out versions of the classic sheepdog wolf kind of metaphor that you saw relevant in gun culture in the past. And that is what the argument looks like, is he divides all people into these different categories. You've got you have people who would be considered wolves or predators, and they're sociopaths, and they fit within a human subspecies, not subhuman species, human subspecies, and they are sort of, or maybe not even species, but well, whatever. This subgroup of humanity that are predators, and they might be psychopathic, they might be sociopathic, but whatever it is about them, it drives them to do these things, prey on other people. And then there are the sheep, which is the normal persons, right? And this is this idea that people are divided into categories, and some people fit within the category of sheep as in within the context of a violent situation or within any sort of ethical framework regarding violence. They are sheep. They don't have any, I mean, they have agency, but they're just ones that get preyed upon. And then there's this third category, which is the sheepdog, which everyone wants to be. And then you've got companies like Sheepdog Defense, and you've got like never ending use of the rhetoric and never ending use of this argument. And the problem that I have with this one is that it's not exactly the psychologist fallacy. It's not exactly the view from above version of the fallacy where we've got two contending ideas that are in contest with another, and a person suggests that they're able to sort of objectively see both sides and then suggest a third way, which turns out just to be one of them, one of the two sides of the argument. It turns out just to be, well, their party line, let's call it. This one is it fits within the category of being a little bit more of that psychological fallacy, that psychology fallacy, in that the person who is giving the description is describing himself as if he is not within that environment. Now, I don't think that if you were to ask Lieutenant Colonel Grossman that if he was not within the environment that constitutes, or he's not affected by the factors which gave him the impression that um, came to this conclusion of the sheepdog wolf metaphor. I think I honestly believe that's something that, like, very quickly, having met him, he would be, oh, okay, I get your point, and maybe change. He would have reconsidered how he wrote the idea. But where it becomes so this is not like an ethical criticism of him, but where this comes out though is that he's describing these things in a sort of definitional sense that and I'm going to quote, I have met these men, these sheepdogs, over and over again. As I interviewed veterans, they are like one U.S. Army lieutenant colonel, a Vietnam veteran, who told me, I learned early on in life that there are people out there who will hurt you if given the chance, and I have devoted my life to being prepared to face them. These men are quite often armed and always vigilant. They would not misuse or misdirect their aggression any more than a sheepdog would misuse or misdirect or would turn on his flock. But in their hearts, many of them yearn for a righteous battle, a wolf upon whom to legitimately and lawfully turn their skills. So, do I think that this exact argument is the best case of a psychologist fallacy? No, but you can see it baked into the cake, in that there is an implicit argument, maybe a implied condition that one person fits within a certain category, or that the environment by which Lieutenant Colonel Grossman is describing is one that he is in too, and he is not, and that is not very clear on how he introduces its influence on him as the author within this book. But does that make the book useless? No, it's actually it is still worth reading, and it is one to keep on the shelf. So what does that mean for the metaphor, right? The sheepdog, wolf metaphor. Well, one of them is that I think that it divides people into categories that should be descriptive but tend to be used prescriptively. So when a person is described as a sheep, they're described as somebody who can't help but be useless in this kind of scenario, or someone they're blind or something like that. Whereas the implication between a wolf and a sheepdog is some form of like moral / capabilities type what do you call it, type difference, whereas the wolf is not necessarily capable but for some reason is predatory, and the sheepdog is someone who's capable but not predatory. And it's kind of an odd, I think that metaphor served its purpose and it's ran out of steam, because we come to understand that the sheep themselves really are not all that harmless, so to speak. They will gladly advocate for the death and destruction or disarmament of peoples, so long as they don't have to get their hands bloody themselves. And that's it's a very different moral framework than sheepdog, wolf. And so for this example, now let's just talk in kind of closing on the psychologist fallacy and why we'd want to be aware of it is there is rhetoric that is used in written language and spoken language and movies and presentation and politics and so forth that oftentimes comes across as not only disconcerting but unconvincing, and we're not exactly sure why. And a psychologist fallacy or a view from above fallacy doesn't necessarily negate the argument that is being made entirely, but it draws attention to a maybe implied perspective, and how that implied perspective, or that within the implication of that perspective, the author is suggesting that there's some form of objectivity to their perception. There's some sort of objectivity to their writing about it. And that would go into a epistemological and metaphysics argument about objectivity versus subjectivity, and that would take a long time for us to address today. But instead, in keeping it tight to this consistent issue, the view from above fallacy, the psychologist fallacy, is one where the author implies or states somehow that their point of observation over the event or the thing that they are talking about, the describing factor, somehow has left them unscathed by their own subjective perspective on it, or that they're not a factor within the environment. With our first article by Ellen, was it Ellen Hayes? Let's go back to the top here. With our article here on a third way of gun reform, just bring it up because it's fine. A third way on gun reform. The author presents herself as if she's trying to argue for a new, better way for us to have conversations about gun reform, and a new, better way for us to have conversations about gun violence and whatever you want to call it in the country. And then she and the whole purpose of this third way is so that we can not be we can sort of get away from partisanship. And then in the end, she just reveals that she's quite partisan in her own positions. She's very, very clearly in one camp, and doesn't have, she calls it success when people are disarmed, when people are having their red flag laws maneuver, things, or when people are specifically even advocating for and facilitating gun buyback programs or voluntary turn-ins or whatever that is. And so that's like, well, you're not really suggesting a third way. You're not really suggesting a third way at all. In fact, you're actually just suggesting a different example of how you could try to make an argument for something that is clearly in one side. It's very much so on one horn of the dilemma. The other one with Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's argument in the version of the psychologist fallacy, which again is still occasionally referred to as the view from above, is that he occasionally leaves out or doesn't include his own participation in the discovery process, and he leaves out, he kind of makes a couple statements, he makes quite a few statements throughout the book with the confidence of objectivity, which would have been appropriately delivered as a subjective one, as from a perspective, as opposed to as if he could somehow perceive it objectively, as in prescriptions over all mankind and to how people think and how people think about violence and so on and so forth. So that being the case, though, this has been a short morning bit for you on the view from above fallacy, on the also known as the psychologist fallacy. And that is what we are trying to do here at Redacted, is give you tools for your toolbox, ways to sharpen your sword when it comes to the mind, and how we think about violence, and how we think about culture, and how we think about what is right and true and good. Because we should not allow our thinking on firearms and violence and all this stuff to be purely driven by people who don't actually know what they're talking about. It's important for us, whether or not it has any impact on anyone over there. It is important for us to be aware of what we think about and how we believe about these ideas of ethics systems and these things that have to do with responsibilities, because even if nothing changes, or if everything changes in the world, we ultimately recognize that we live in a moral environment as well as a legal one, and what is moral is not the same as what is legal, and sometimes those two things conflict, and we have to make the choice in that point. And the last thing that we want to do is be in a position where that's the first time we've ever considered our moral framework, is when we're in a life or death or a life or death situation, whether that has to do with us or somebody else. So that being the case, this is the Redacted Culture Cast. You can support the show on at locals, which would be redactedculture.locals.com, or you can support us through our merch links, which is redactedllc.com. All of that stuff is how we keep the lights on and how we keep the show rolling. With that being the case, then we're going to close out with Go Forth and Conquer.